Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. Before we delve into the program proper, I would like to highlight that we do have translation for this event. So I would, unless you're bilingual, I encourage you to either join the English or the French channel. And I also encourage the panelists, the amazing panelists that are with us today, to please put on your cameras so that we can see who you are. Welcome to a very important conversation today, a webinar that is focused on debt and development and the human costs of delay, and why urgent steps are needed on debt restructuring, and why we simply cannot wait. I would like to highlight that this is one of the official side events of the T20 program, and it is brought to you by the Conversation Africa in collaboration with Caritas International and the New Economy Hub. It is also, unfortunately, the last webinar in the Conversation Africa's virtual dialogue series for 2025. My name is Awa Ture with the African Climate Foundation. I am proudly from the Gambia, and I will be your moderator for today. So thank you for joining us. A warm welcome to you all, and a special thank you and welcome to our experts and panelists that will spark the conversation today, a very needed conversation around debt restructuring and what that means in real terms. So if you permit me, I will first start with some housekeeping rules. The first is that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Conversation Africa's YouTube playlist in a few days. The second thing to note is that there will be a Q&A section later. Hopefully time will permit us to do that. So if you want to engage with us on this conversation today, please drop your questions in the Q&A and we will attend to them later. The third announcement will be that if you are sharing this conversation within your networks, we encourage you to use the hashtags for this event, hashtag TCA Dialogue, hashtag Debt Justice, hashtag Reform Now. So now let's get into the thick of things. So the genesis of this conversation, or the framing of this conversation, is really around the Jubilee Report, which was released earlier this year in June. And it was really born out of a response to the current realities, the reality of debt distress, development needs, and a climate crisis that we are seeing in a developing world today. So where you see debt-distressed countries sacrificing critical investments in health, in education, in infrastructure, instead servicing debt serviced costs. And so the Jubilee Report frames this discussion or these issues as not just a debt crisis, not just numbers, but a developmental issue and a justice crisis that has opportunity costs for the people of developing nations, where countries are not just defaulting on their debts, but they're defaulting on their people, on their environment, and on their future. So there is a call to address some of the systemic issues that are perpetuating this cycle of indebtedness in developing countries. So a critical call for reform of the international financial architecture, a call for addressing some of the domestic issues that are perpetuating the cycle of incurring debt or that is not going to productive sectors within developed nations. So this is a really important conversation today. So significant debt relief. The HIPIC was born out of some of the recommendations that were made 25 years ago. But 25 years later, the world confronts another debt crisis. And the Commission, the reason for commissioning such a report is really to make sure that we can offer practical and principled recommendations to really address the current crisis and to advance a vision that allows for a financial architecture that prevents such crises from happening again. So we also want to make sure that the framing moves from diagnosis to real action, to real solutions that are implementable within our giving context. So today we have some notable experts that will take us through this discourse around debt and what that means and what we should do in the future. So I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, I would like to introduce Jason Rosario Braganza. That is Afrodad's Executive Director. He's a Kenyan economist with over 10 years of experience on international development in Africa. Over the past decade, Jason has focused his work on trade and regional integration, finance for development and tax, illicit financial flows, and domestic resource mobilization, as well as poverty and inequality. Jason also served as the co-head and program director of tax at the International Lawyers Project. So thank you for being with us here today, Jason. Next, I would like to introduce Lucy Afandi Espila, who's the regional coordinator at Caritas Africa, and is the first woman, the youngest person to serve in this role in the region's history during the General Assembly in May 2023. She joined Caritas Africa as a policy and advocacy officer in June 2020, following a very progressive journey that began at Caritas on September 10, 2018 to December 2019. Prior to joining Caritas Kenya, she played a key role in launching and managing the Diosan radio station in Maralal. Lucy holds a master's degree in development diplomacy and international security from Daystar University and has over a decade of experience in development and international advocacy. She has led processes in knowledge production, change management, and institutional policy reforms. Welcome, Lucy, and we look forward to hearing from you. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Professor Danielle Bradlow, who is a professor and a senior research fellow at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. He's also a senior G20 advisor at the South African Institute of International Affairs and a non-resident fellow at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University, and professor emeritus at the American University Washington College of Law. His recent publications include The Law of International Financial Institutions, a new conceptual framework for African sovereign debt, finding an optimal outcome that addresses the 5 challenges. So with that being said, I would like to dive straight into the very, very interesting discourse on debt and what that means for human development and the costs we are seeing. We want to move beyond just talking about numbers to what that means in real terms. So I'll start with Jason, if you may. So Jason, how have civil society movements, in your opinion, shaped global debt justice campaigns since the Stiglitz Commission?
Great. Thank you, Awa, and thank you to the Conversation Africa for hosting this very important conversation, and the last one, at least in the series, but also very close to the G20 summit that's going to be taking place in South Africa in a couple of weeks. The Stiglitz Commission report came at a time when lots of conversations were being discussed and had around how to deal with the debt crisis, particularly in Africa, but more generally in the global South. The prevailing architecture that allows or facilitates borrowing by developing countries from different sources, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, hasn't much changed, though the creditors or lenders have changed quite significantly, and the composition therein of the portfolio of debt that many developing countries have changed quite dramatically. And so part of what the Stiglitz Commission, together with the United Nations Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, has been trying to do is figure out how can we recalibrate the global debt architecture to factor in these changes in the way different creditors do business with Africa in particular. Now, civil society organizations in particular have been very worried about the disparity in the power asymmetry that exists between lenders and borrowers. In particular, the debt architecture has four key players, if you like, or four and a half, if you like. You've got the borrowers, you've got the different strands of lenders, bilateral, multilateral, commercial, and then you've got credit rating agencies. The half you could call the International Monetary Fund because it's supposed to act both as a creditor but also a mediator. So you say you can have four and a half actors, but these actors haven't evolved enough, and none of them seem to have agreed on how to deal with the current debt crisis. And also there are some contradictions in that composition where you have the IMF both as a mediator through the prevailing G20 common framework, but is also a creditor. And so in terms of how or whose interests are going to be put on the table when restructuring are being considered, is most likely to be that of credits. And we've seen this in the case of the few countries that have attempted to restructure their debt under the G20 framework. So what civil society organizations, particularly from Africa, were saying was, why can't we recalibrate this power distribution and democratize the process a little bit to allow borrowing countries and borrowers in particular to have a more fair voice, a more open voice in this restructuring. So one of the big calls was to have an intergovernmental process within the auspices of the United Nations that could give us or give rise to the establishment of a UN Framework Convention on debt, on sovereign debt. The others were a set of proposals that could improve the debt restructuring, debt repayment systems for borrowing countries. So, for example, to have debt pause clauses in the case of different calamities or catastrophes. If we take Jamaica, for the island of Jamaica, for example, that has recently experienced this terrible hurricane, if there was a trigger clause in their debt contract that would allow them to suspend their debt servicing up until the point they're able to get back on their feet again, then this would be something that we could bring or introduce into the conversation. The other thing we were asking for as civil society organizations is governance. We do know that corruption, lack of transparency on both the borrower side as well as the lender side is something that's quite prevalent in the sector. And so, we've seen in the case of Mozambique, the tuna bond scandal, where both the Credit Suisse was involved in lending to a government without following proper procedures. And this has been confirmed in a court of law, the tuna bond scandal. We've seen more recently in the Republic of Senegal, the new administration there has discovered a whole raft of borrowing that was done that was not known to the public or to the parliament. And so we need to be able to have a new dispensation on debt transparency, both from the lender side of things as well as the borrowers. We cannot continue shining the light or spotlighting just borrowers and claiming that it is corrupt African leaders that are borrowing carelessly or borrowing for purposes that are not for development. We need to also put the light on creditors and ask very difficult questions of our creditors if they are knowingly lending to governments that are not going to use these debts in the correct way or not going to follow procedures in procuring the debt in according to the legislation. So these are just a sample of what African civil society organizations and more generally global civil society organizations had been looking to present to couple both the Stiglitz Commission report together with what was also being presented at the United Nations Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development as a way of bringing together processes. I think one of the successful things that happened 25 years ago under HIPIC was that there was a convergence of thought. There was a convergence of agenda to deal with the debt crisis at the time, albeit, it has had its issues. But I think 25 years later, in 2025, there seems to be too many disparate items happening at the same time, and therefore this lack of convergence and coherence in the current way of wanting to deal with the debt crisis is causing a lot of confusion. It's causing a lot of delay in actually getting anything substantive coming out of the restructuring process. And so part of what we would like to see in the discussion today, and maybe moving through into South Africa, I know Professor Bradlow is going to talk a little bit about that, is a coherent set of proposals that go into the G20. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I think a really spot-on point around the shared responsibility and need for convergence around this issue. May I bring in Lucy for a bit? So, Lucy, from your point of view, what has changed since the last Jubilee report, and why do we need different action?
Thank you so much, Awa, and I really would like to start by appreciating the points from Jason, especially when he points out that we need to be nuanced when we discuss this issue about debt and not continuously just saying, oh, African governments are borrowing and we have corruption, but we are not looking at the system itself and how unfair it has been. About what has changed, I think the more things change, the more things remain the same. And I will not say that we have seen much change, because if you look at the African context right now in our current landscape, we're experiencing a lot of political instability, and most of our problems are interlinked. If you look at in Kenya, I am from Kenya, but I live in Togo. But if you look at in Kenya at some time in 2024, there's a time we had a series of protests. And if you deepen your analysis around this is part of the reason because of these austerity measures, which affect the common citizen and the things that they need. If you're going to spike up the prices of oil, sugar, things that people need on their day-to-day, they are bound to feel affected and they're bound to go out to the streets and protest. And even if right about now you look at these different African countries, whether it's Tanzania, whichever country you'll think about, people are going out to the street to protest. Yes, we are calling for democracy, we are calling for human rights, but all these problems, even when it comes to the debt distress, they are all interlinked. I don't think much has changed, but there's a lot that has to be done in terms of action, based from the historical issues that we have seen and the historical problems that we've seen from way back then. If you look before, we had the structural adjustment programs back then, and then we now have these poverty strategy reduction papers. And if you look at what is happening, much as we are calling for change, the logic still remains the same. It means we do not have the financial autonomy, the policy prescriptions from these Bretton Woods institutions continue to determine the fiscal policies that our governments are pushing for. And so and this morning also, when I was reflecting on it, I was asking myself, what decision-making power do we have as people maybe in these developing countries? If you look at the way the structure of the IMF and World Bank looks like, the countries, the wealthier nations, they are the ones who control this because they are able to contribute more quotas. And as a result, they are able to make decisions on loans and all these things and the programs which are important. And at the end of the day, these countries which are developing do not have much say. So our decision-making power is limited. And much as we see that there are injustices, much as we see that this global financial architecture does not work for us, we may not be able to advocate for reforms that will work for us. We keep thinking about debt as a liquidity program, as a liquidity problem. And if you see even the way banks function, maybe even if it's people who are borrowing, they make money out of selling loans and the interests that are given to them. And so you look at our African countries, we end up paying these debts at inordinate amounts when it comes to interest. And wealthier nations who you would expect to carry the bigger burden end up paying at a lower rate. And so what means is more money is leaving these African countries, and a little bit of it is actually channeled towards development, towards healthcare and all these things. I was reflecting the other day on a simple thing. The other day I was reflecting on women. So if a woman was today to go to hospital and you're told, oh, there's a problem, you're not able to conceive because of this and this problem. And so you need to pay this amount of money, maybe 4,000 euros. And imagine this is a person in the village down there. How do they access healthcare services to address these little things that affect their day-to-day lives? And if you look at it from the dimension of human rights, all states who promote these are supposed to provide shelter, healthcare, food. And it's the simple things that are affected. If today someone was to go to hospital and you're told you have cancer and you're supposed to start treatment, or someone has a problem with their kidney and you're supposed to start the treatment, you're not able to pay for these things. And so as we reflect, these topics, they appear really far-fetched from us, but they affect us in our day-to-day lives. And I really do not think much has changed after the Jubilee Report. We are aware of the problems. We are aware that this system is not sustainable. We are depending on debt to sustain our economies, but really it does not work for us. And maybe we need to reflect more on what can be done internally to see what change that we can get, especially now that we are fighting a system that has been there since years ago, since the World War, when they created this institution, which is supposed to drive the economies of some and leave others in perpetual poverty. Looking at our role, maybe within our context, because of the International Division of Labor, we are supposed to produce raw materials, we are supposed to pay for loans, and we are supposed to build these other economies as we remain in the same situation. So nothing much has changed, but we need to continue to drive for this change. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucy. And I think that was a brilliant way of moving us from an abstract concept of debt and what it means to a very real life example of how debt servicing actually crowds out, expenditure in priority areas such as health. And that has very real impacts, whether it comes to access to healthcare or education or elsewhere. So thank you for that. And I think that's a very good segue into bringing in Professor Danny for him to really speak about the cost of delay. And from a development economics perspective, what indicators, Prof, do you think best captures this cost of delay?
Thank you, Awa, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I think Jason and Lucy have given an excellent background to this and have said much of what could be said to explain what the cost of delay is. But I think the best way to see that is when a country gets into debt difficulty, it's faced with a terrible dilemma because it has to decide, do we have to pay our creditors or do we have to support our responsibilities and obligations to our citizens and their development? And in a sense, they're bound to do both because they've signed contracts promising to pay back their loans, and countries that don't live up to their obligations incur costs for doing that as well. But they also have commitments to their citizens that they have to live up to. And balancing that is a terrible dilemma. And just to give you some numbers to show you what the costs of that are, is in 23 countries are considered by the IMF at the moment to be in debt distress. About half the African population is now living in countries which are spending more servicing their debts than on either health and or education in those countries, which has obvious effects. 17 countries in 2023, the UN said, was actually having net debt flows into their countries. So in other words, more money was leaving the country than coming into the country, which makes it very difficult for the country to really support its development itself. So that's the cost of, and the cost of delay then becomes the longer it takes for the country to resolve that debt crisis, the more time it takes, it's left without the ability to finance its development needs in the way that it should be financing those development needs. So that gets you back to where Jason was talking about the problems with the current arrangements for debt, which are If you look at the examples of Zambia or Ghana, it takes years to work their way to reach an agreement with their creditors about how they're going to resolve their debt crisis. And because of the complexity of the situation, it often means they end up getting less debt relief than they should. And that's partly because the process is cumbersome and slow. It's partly because of the complicated role of the IMF in the process. As Jason said, they're both a creditor and an advisor to everybody in the negotiations. And even more importantly, they make the debt sustainability analysis that determines how much debt relief the country will get. And as a creditor, they obviously have a conflicted view on how much relief they would like to give the country. And the less relief, the better for them, the more money the country has to pay back. So delay becomes worse because of the problems in the way in which the system is structured now. But I think we also need to keep in mind that countries have to finance their development. But how they do that is a question of their responsibility and their decision making as well. And as Lucy hinted, it's also a question of, are they going to live up to their human rights obligations, their obligations to support health, education, decent standards of living for their own populations? Or are they going to take on debts, like in the case of the tuna bond scandal or things like that, which are irresponsible to take on, which also have to be brought into this? And in that regard, I think one interesting thing to keep in mind is if you look at the commercial creditors of most countries, if you look at the website of almost any big financial institution in the world, let alone in our own countries, you will find many of them have human rights policies, which say that they respect human rights and they're willing to live up to those human rights. I've never seen a situation in a debt restructuring where they actually say we need to do this because of our own policies and our own responsibilities as human rights respecting institutions. And I think part of our job in thinking this is to think through how do we hold their feet to the fire to make them do that. And the Jubilee Report is one way that highlights the need for them to be thinking that way. And so hopefully over time that begins to change as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. I think all three of you have highlighted the asymmetries in the current debt infrastructure framework and how that has an impact on or in perpetuating the cycle of indebtedness in the global South. So I'm going to stick with you for a little bit, Professor Danny. So do you think Africa or the global South can secure a seat at the table when it comes to financial decision making? And how do we do that?
So I think it's important to acknowledge that Africa does have a seat in some forums of decision making. I mean, the fact that South Africa is chairing the G20 this year is one indication of that. The African Union is in the room also as a full member of the G20. African countries are represented on the boards of the major international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. We don't have as much representation as we need, and the structuring of that is not as good as it could be. But we need to acknowledge that we are there. And the way in which decisions are made in those institutions mean that there is space for some advocacy by our representatives on those bodies. Whether they do it as effectively as possible is another question, which needs to be thought through as well. But having said that, I mean, it's clear that we're not in all the rooms where all the decisions are made, where we should have more access to those rooms. I think it's also important to recognize that the problem is a very complicated one, because if there is representation, it's often at the state level. That doesn't mean the interests of the people of Africa are necessarily receiving all the representation and that their interests are being stated as effectively as they could. And that's sort of where the human rights dimension becomes important and where questions of accountability. Can we hold the institutions of global governance where these decisions are made accountable for the way they make these decisions? So if we think, for example, the IMF is not behaving in a responsible and fair way in its debt discussions, say in countries like, if in the examples of Zambia or Ghana, can we hold them accountable in some way for that? Or at least the people of those countries could do that. So it's a complicated governance question, but we need more representation, both at a regional level, because some of this is, how does Africa make decisions as a continent, and how do we make sure that all the right stakeholders have a decision in that, as well as at the global level as well.
Thank you, Prof. And I think in terms of advocacy, I'll shift a little bit to Lucy. Since the launch of the Jubilee Report, Caritas International has launched the Turn Debt into Hope campaign. Can you tell us a little bit about it and why it's important?
Thank you, Awa. So yes, we launched the Turn Debt into Hope campaign, and the idea is just to raise awareness of this issue of debt and also give people hope. And it means that if people are able to access resources, for example, African governments are able to have the level of liquidity that is required, and also looking at solvency. So this thing is sustainable. It means that resources will be freed and people have access to healthcare, people have access to education and social protection services. And the idea is to break down this issue on debt, because more often than not, it appears complex. And as the Catholic Church, we work with communities at the local level. And if we are to address governance issues, it's important for them to understand this issue of debt and how it impacts them, and it helps them to shape decisions when it comes to decision making, as Jason had mentioned earlier on, when we are talking of African governments and how they are, how do citizens also perceive them in terms of management, also the debt management and all that. We are also looking at this other dimension, the people who are lenders and whatnot, discussing on issues to do with debt restructuring, the reform of the global finance architecture. And this is not a generosity issue, it is a justice issue, because a lot of money is leaving Africa because we are producers of raw materials. And so there's a lot of extractivism that happens. If you go to DR Congo, they have their minerals. If you come to Liberia, we have rubber. If you come to these different African countries, they have their own minerals, and a lot of extractivism happens. And these wealthier nations will make money out of that. And then they will be able to invest their quotas into these Bretton Woods institutions, and then we'll go ahead and borrow from them. And if you look at the years and years of these injustices that are occurring, we are talking about this as a justice issue and not a generosity issue, just to raise awareness of this. And what we are calling for is also to look at the social and the moral dimension, because when there is inaction and when there is delay, a lot of things happen. There is an issue to do with underfunded hospitals. Sometimes you'll hear, oh, we don't have medication in these hospitals because there's little funding that is going around to these hospitals, and basic things are not able to be accessed. We have fewer classrooms, we have shuttered local businesses. This also occurs when we see protests, when people are not happy with the political landscape. And you'll see people will go and attack the small businesses that are there. And also some people are having to close down because of the economic decline. We are seeing families being pushed into poverty because of medical costs. And what happens is, if you do not have access to insurance, you have to pay out of pocket for healthcare. And so these are the dimensions that we are calling it is a moral issue. We are also looking at dimensions of income inequality in places where there is a tax burden. So when people are being told to address this issue of debt management, and then we have austerity measures, and so it means some governments will have to raise taxes, and it eats into people's payslips. And so the tax burden more often than not affects the poor more than the rich. And it translates to this issue of people having to pay out of pocket with money that they do not have. Then we have income inequality. So the rich will be able to travel and go and elsewhere to go and look for medical aid elsewhere, or to be treated elsewhere. But you have to stay in country and deal with the issues over there. And there's a moral dimension, the income inequality, that is really visible around that. We are also looking at issues to do with mental health. I remember the other day we were sitting in a meeting here, and we were discussing on young people and drug abuse. Because if people are unemployed and they are free, one of the things that they will do is turn to drugs. And I remember one government official was saying, we do not have enough resources to spend a lot of money on awareness raising. The little money that we have has to go into something concrete to address this drug problem. But you realize awareness raising is one of the components to address this particular issue. And so if people do not have finances to address these issues that affect the fabric of society, it contributes to mental health problems, it contributes to depression and all these things. So the different problems that we have, as I said before, are interlinked. And as Caritas, we are raising awareness both at the community level with decision makers and working together with civil society so that we are all aware about this issue of sovereign debt and how it affects us and why there is a need for reforms to look at these things. And so in a way that we will see wealthier nations carrying the burden. I appreciate what Professor said that now we see African governments in these spaces with the AU or the G20, South Africa chairing, but what does it translate to? Are we able to push for economic reforms? Can people listen to you if you're a person who's always borrowing? If you're in a context, even if you were to sit in a social context, the people with money, they have more power, they have more agency, more than the people who are always borrowing. And you who is always borrowing, you always have to compromise. You always have to take decisions that will affect other people so that you're able to bring in more income, which at the end of the day does not end up being sustainable. It's more about more money that is being used to service debts and the interest and not focusing on the needs of the people. And so this is what we are trying to call for, to raise awareness of this in different levels and also to see how we can attain change, maybe in some small way. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I think you mentioned two fundamental points. One on the issue of charity and the other on the tax burden. So I'm gonna shift the conversation back to Jason to speak to those. So Jason, from your perspective, how can we shift the global debate from charity to justice? That's one. And two, based on your work on domestic resource mobilization, what are some of the steps or strategies that developing countries can take to raise resources domestically without leading to a tax burden that leads to citizens out on the street?
Great. Thank you, Awa, once again. And also let me just appreciate both Professor Bradlow and Lucy for those very important insights in how this conversation is interlinked and the intersections that exist. I think on the first point on the issue of justice that we're talking about, it's not just about debt justice specifically. This is about socioeconomic justice. This is about justice in order to meet obligations that exist between citizens and the state, most importantly. And I think that needs to come back to this conversation. I think the Jubilee Commission report does try to put that on the table, particularly in the latter parts of the report, in its recommendations, in terms of the principles that are supposed to be adhered to in trying to reform the debt architecture. I think the second point here, and both Professor Bradlow and Lucy have spoken to this, is that there are trade-offs. If a government decides consciously and deliberately to prioritize creditors, it is inadvertently telling citizens we do not care about the fate of you as citizens, and therefore we have prioritized paying our creditors so that we can continue borrowing for whatever purposes and be in good standing with international capital markets in terms of our credit rating agency. And I think in terms of credit rating agencies, and I think the momentum and the coming together of solidarity movements and people movements in terms of advocating for justice needs to be aware, and we need to moralize the discussion again. I think there isn't enough moralizing of the conversation to actually show that there is a human cost that is being incurred by particularly the African continent in this regard. If you think about two important dimensions that are being discussed outside of debt, number one is the demographic dividend of the African continent, a young population with so much potential, but there are no jobs. Lucy has talked about the deficiency of the healthcare system, the deficiency inadvertently that's going to happen of the education system, because resources, Professor Bradlow talked about that, but resources are being diverted from education, health towards creditors. That has a significant medium to long-term impact on the educational outcomes of young people on this continent. What is going to happen to the labor capability of young African people, young Africans in the next 10, 15, 20 years when they're not able to go to schools? In my country, Kenya, right now, there is a university shutdown because lecturers have gone on strike because of not being paid, right? And the reason they're not being paid is the government in its current budget has diverted money from public universities into debt servicing. So what happens in that situation? And so this idea of justice, debt justice, needs not to be anchored in a silo of just the issue of the debt architecture. There is a broader social economic perspective that we need to take into consideration, and the moral fabric needs to be woven a lot more tightly and finely as it was done in 25 years ago when we had the HIPC debt cancellation. Incidentally, that is one of the principles or recommendations that the Commission's report makes for the inclusion, for the potential of a HIPC 2, right? That there needs to be a tighter argument or a bringing together of particularly commercial and private creditors to the table so that they can understand what is at stake in this instance. And so I do think when we talk about it in this context, that we are able to articulate our argument in a very strong moral way. The parallel I will draw with this is what we did in redefining the term illicit financial flows. For a very long time, before illicit financial flows included things like tax avoidance, right? People argued that this is a moralistic approach to, you're trying to impose morals on companies or individuals on how they plan or make their taxes efficient. But, it was consistent messaging that this was immoral, it was wrong, it was a deliberate bending of the rules for private gain at the cost of public coffers, and was therefore deemed to be an illicit act, not an illegal act, but an illicit and immoral act. And we need to bring that back to the table. And I think the Jubilee Commission report, together with the Turn Debt into Hope campaign led by Caritas, has a very important role to play in this. Now, onto your second point about the domestic resource mobilization that you're referencing, I think we need to look at this in one very clear perspective. In the present time that we are in, it is an exercise in futility. And you'll excuse me to the viewers, to those who are following this conversation today, it is an exercise in futility to try and raise domestic resource mobilization, particularly through taxation, and I should say regressive taxation in this case, in the case of many African countries, only for it to be diverted to debt servicing. In Kenya, it was one of the local newspapers published a report saying that close to 80 or 90, between 80 and 90% of Kenya's tax revenues are now going to debt servicing. So the government signed into law 2 weeks ago a whole raft of new taxes, including levies on buying things like airplane tickets and so on. But what is the point of introducing domestic resource mobilization efforts if all you're going to do in the immediate and short term is divert that money out of the economy in towards debt servicing in order for you to continue borrowing and perpetuating that cycle? So I do think it is imperative when we're talking about domestic resource mobilization in the immediate term and present time is that we need to be aware of this context. There are countries that are spending well over 50, 60, 70% of their tax. And I want to emphasize tax, not their budget, because the budget includes everything. I'm talking about tax, right? So this is what the revenue administrations collect through different types, and the main source of revenue for governments is taxation. So if you can fathom, and the viewers can fathom, more than 70% of that tax revenue being diverted to debt servicing, leaving only 30% on average for running government, doing development, we are not going to go anywhere. And so we need, and this is a very, very important part around domestic resource mobilization in this present moment that many African countries face at the, with the decisions, at the very difficult decisions that they have to make. But let me be propositional, and something that the Jubilee Commission report perhaps didn't factor in enough, because I don't think there's been a lot of research that has been done on it. But the IMF and the World Bank often advocate for something called a debt ceiling, right? So it's borrowing up to a certain point as a proportion of your GDP, your gross domestic product. What I would like this forum, and perhaps Professor Bradlaugh, who's a lot more experienced than many of us in this and has access to powers that some of us only wish we could have, but is to start thinking about a debt service ratio, a debt service to tax revenue ratio, whereby you are able to create an upper ceiling or a ring fence in your domestic legislation and your domestic law that says your government or a government in Africa is only allowed to allocate a specific percentage of its tax revenue towards debt servicing, right? This is one potential option that would protect the tax base for African countries from being used as a way of only appeasing creditors and trading off development at the expense of citizens. Zambia have sort of tried to introduce this under their negotiations for a common under the common framework. I think they've put it at around 16 to 18%. It's something that they're still trying to introduce in law. But I would say, as a being proposition and solution oriented around this conversation around DRM, is to protect the DRM in law, so that even when countries are going to negotiate with their creditors, whether it's through the common framework or whether it's bilaterally, countries can actually say, look, we have this in our law. We cannot allocate more than X% to all our debt servicing. So you who wants 10% can only get 3.5% or something like that. And I think this is one way, just to micro down what Professor Bradlaugh was saying about being at the table to make decisions. We can do that at the national level and then increase that and macro that up into the regional and continental level. The last point I want to make on DRM is to say that the African Union Commission has made great strides in the last 12, 15 months towards linking the debt conversation with illicit financial flows and DRM. So this year they had the first ever Pan-African Conference on Debt in Togo, which gave us the Lome Declaration and has some really good progressive continental ideas that could bring together the continent to protect the resource base, as well as the debt servicing structures and processes that are there. It is also now presented, I think, just last week in Washington during the annual meetings, the Common African Position on Debt, which also, again, has something around the debt servicing restructuring process. And the last part of that is also dealing with the issue of making debt or finance cheaper, the cost of capital, because that's the other bit of the equation that is eating into the revenue streams of our governments, is that the cost of accessing international capital is extremely expensive. Africa, on average, pays 4 times more to access finance internationally than other developing regions. And this is a huge issue. I know the South African government had a commission that was supposed to look into this. Regrettably, though, it was sort of reduced into a chapter, into a broader debt segment. But the cost of debt is something that we also need to look at. So these, for me, would be the thing around the DRM and the justice elements that I would say are very important for us to think about moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that, a very robust response, Jason, and also kickstarting us on the discussion around solutions and recommendations. I already see that there are some pertinent questions from participants, so I'll shift gears to give voice to those that have joined us on the call. The first question, and this is, I'm going to throw it to the panel to come in on any one of these two questions that I'm going to start with. A lot has been made of establishing borrowers' clubs as a lever for getting the debt justice developing economies need. Could the speakers tell us a little bit more about what borrowers' clubs are, why they are required, and how they work to rebalance the scales as we've been told they might? So that's one question. And the second question is, a lot has been said about the information asymmetries between mainly debt-distressed borrowers, most of which are in Africa, and lenders, particularly private. So what is meant by these information asymmetries? What underpins them? And what underpins them? And can you give us a clear understanding of the root causes of the problem and what's required in terms of priority to help African and developing economies? So I'll maybe start with Prof. Daniel to give Jason a little bit of a breather before we come back to you.
Great, thanks. I mean, there's a lot there, and there were some things that Jason said that I wanted to respond to as well. But let me start with the questions. Excuse me, on the Borrowers Club. I mean, a borrowers club can mean many different things. One possibility, the most extreme, would be a club where all the borrowers meet together and jointly negotiate debt agreements and then distribute the money amongst themselves in some way. That is a very difficult thing to do. In the 1980s, for example, South American countries, when they were having their debt crisis, tried to form a borrowers club like that, in which they would negotiate with all their creditors as a group. And it was a very easy thing for the creditors in that case to go to Mexico and say, listen, you've got a serious debt problem, you need debt relief. We will give you a more favorable deal than we were going to, provided you leave the borrowers club. And so they managed to divide and conquer, basically, and to stop the borrowers club. A borrowers club, where it can be extremely useful, and I think this is more what is in mind, but in the suggestions now, is that if it can be a forum where borrowers can meet to share information, do peer learning, develop capacity, and share and learn how to negotiate better with their creditors, and develop positions on the broader issues of debt and debt restructuring, and then advocate together in some way, but that not allow each of them to negotiate with their creditors as they see fit for themselves, because each country is so different that they need to be able to have the flexibility to decide for themselves what to do. So I think that's where the debate is. I personally believe that the best for Africa would be to have an African borrowers club, because I think Africa's problems are unique to Africa. Every other region's problems are unique to that region, and that we as a continent need to develop our positions regionally before we go forward and talk to other regions about how to develop a global South borrowers position. And it's important to recognize, and coming from South Africa, that's important, is that some countries are both creditors and debtors. And so their positions are going to be much more complicated than other countries, which are only creditors. So that's on the first question. On the second question of the information asymmetries, I think an important issue is transparency. That there's a very opaque way in which debt transactions are often done. Sometimes the creditors And China is often accused of this, but they're certainly not the only creditor that does this, is they insist on confidentiality. So nobody can know exactly what the terms and conditions of particular transactions are. And so there's a big push now to establish a global debt registry so that debt transactions can be registered and everybody can know who's borrowed what from whom and on what terms. And that would make it much easier for everybody to understand where the risks are, how to get the best possible deals, etc. So that's an important issue on the agenda for now. Can I just take this opportunity to respond on the issue of cost of capital, because I think it's a very important issue. There's no question that there's an African premium that's being charged. What's harder to understand is what is that premium? What are the causes of it? And so I think more than a cost of capital commission, what's needed is some sort of technical review of what are all the barriers that Africa is facing to accessing affordable, predictable, and sustainable flows of development finance. And once we understand that, then we can begin to address that, some of which would be addressed at a global level, some at a regional level, and some at a national level. But it's broader than just a question of assuming there's one or a small number of causes of the cost of capital. The last thing I just have to comment on is on the debt service ratio idea that Jason mentioned, which I think is a creative idea. There are a couple of things I would point out about that. Is in the 1980s in Latin America, Peru, President Alan Garcia in Peru said that he would only pay 10% of export revenues to his creditors to service their debt, and the rest would go to development. And he was punished very seriously because he was threatened with being sued for default. He lost access to new money for a while. It turned out there were a number of other countries that were actually paying less than 10% of their export revenues for debt service and using the rest for other purposes, but they never said this publicly. And the banks went along with that. So there's a lesson in whether you want to make it explicit or not. But I also think it's important to keep in mind that the problem with setting limits on these sorts of things is that the future is such an unpredictable place, and that understanding what exactly the limit should be and having the flexibility on sometimes to escape from that limit for necessary reasons. For example, like in the terrible case of Jamaica, where it's been hit with this terrible hurricane, its export earnings are going to be cut as well. Its need to import is going to be much more than it was before. Having to spend more of its export earnings to borrow on borrowed money to address this crisis might be the only choice it has to actually work out of the crisis. And just as another example, if you think of Germany, which had a debt limit on how much deficit spending it can do, on what the government deficit can be, it's caused enormous problems for Germany, and it's now had to change its law to work out ways out of that debt limit in order to deal with the infrastructure deficits in the country. So I would say we need to think carefully about how to structure those sorts of proposals, but I think they're creative ideas. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. Danny. Can we invite Lucy for her reflections?
I think maybe I will just make a reflection on this issue of information asymmetry, and also the reason why we should call for transparency when it comes to the terms and conditions of these loans. Because if you're accessing, like what he mentioned in terms of China, if we're accessing loans and the terms and conditions are not clear because of confidentiality, it leads to trust deficit. And more often than not, governments are using tax revenue, as Jensen mentioned, to service these debts. And so this issue of information asymmetry should be addressed, and the information should be open source so that citizens are able to build this relation with government, knowing that they are making decisions on their behalf. And this information on when they borrow and the income that is coming into the country is able to generate to things that also make sense to them. So maybe that is the only thing that I want to highlight there, and also to also appreciate what Jensen mentioned on domestic resource mobilization, and knowing that tax cannot be a source of income, and if we cannot tax a country into prosperity. Just to appreciate that one thing that was said. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Jason, may I invite you for your reflections?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think the point on the Borrowers Club has been fantastically covered by Professor Bradlow. So I'll just go to the question around information asymmetries. And I'll use this very simple example, which is the credit rating agencies and the methodology that they use to rank different African countries on their suitability to access capital from international capital markets. Earlier this year, during the IMF and World Bank spring meetings in Washington, D.C., we had a session where one of the credit rating agencies, the big three, was asked, how many times do you have people coming onto the continent to do these assessments? And they did mention one country. I wouldn't mention which country this is, but they actually do not have an expert stationed in this African country. The individual is not from the African continent, and the person only comes to this country once a year, right, to conduct some sort of assessment, go back to the headquarters and write up this report, that stipulates why they think this particular country is either good for going to international capital markets or not. But the reason I'm using this example is that whilst the rating that is awarded to the country is made public, the actual detailed methodology that is implemented or that is utilized to come up with this ranking is generally not publicly available or is not public information. And so when you are trying to understand why is it that it costs so much more for an African government to go to international capital markets than it would than a country from the global south, then you've got to wonder about the biases that exist. So that's just one example where these information asymmetries tend to exist. If you think of the two examples I cited in my first submission on Mozambique and now more recently Senegal, you would have to believe that the creditors were aware that they were lending to governments that had questionable transparency, accountability, and good governance procedures. And again, that information asymmetry with regards to whether the public was aware that this was going on is something that we need to, really keep in check. So what we've been doing at Aphrodite, for example, and if you don't mind me, just plugging Aphrodite here in for a little bit, is we have something called the African Borrowing Charter, which is a set of principles that we recommend both governments, members of parliament, and members of the public use as a way to strengthen and advance checks and balances when it comes to public debt. So one of the things that we are proposing that could mitigate against the information asymmetries, for instance, is a piece of legislation or requirement in the law that governments do public consultations on certain debts that they're intending to procure. And this public consultation would have the benefit of, enhancing and promoting greater transparency on public borrowing, both from the government's point of view as a borrower, but also we would know a little bit more about the lender, the terms and conditions, even, as Professor Bradlow mentioned, sometimes there are these NDAs that certain creditors put out, but at basic, there are some information that creditors wouldn't mind being in the public domain: interest rates, duration, purpose, and things like that, as a starting point. So I do think there are ways in which we can overcome the information asymmetries by implementing certain very bare minimum legislative reforms in the procurement of public debt. And incidentally, this is in the Jubilee Commission report. It is one of the proposals that came out of the Compromiso de Sevilla during the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development. And so it's not something new. It is part of the UNCTAD's sovereign debt borrowing principles of responsible lending and borrowing. So these are not new things, but just things that if we did implement, we would be able to deal with the information asymmetries there. And I think we also strengthen the accountability line between citizens and the state when it comes to issues of public borrowing. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. So one final question from our participants. Thank you, Patrick, for your intervention. So Patrick says, what more would be required to move us forward on an intervention that would either obviate the need for a HIPC 2 initiative and or tee up a fairer HIPC 2 initiative as we approach the pre-HIPC 1 conditions? So just brief reflections across the panel. Jason, we could start with you quickly. And then we move to some questions on the way forward.
Yeah, so two things very quickly on what could move us towards HIPC 2. I think number one is we need a stronger moral argument on why we are in a debt crisis. And this means also defining very clearly that this is not a liquidity crisis. This is a solvency crisis. Countries just cannot pay. My own country, Kenya, has just gone and done a very expensive buyback deal for a euro bond that is due next year in 2020. It's the highest premium this year that an African country has taken out to do a buyback. So we need to moralize the argument for a HIPC 2 initiative, and find a very strong moral fabric to make the argument that for Africa, this crisis is not only a debt crisis, it is a development crisis, it's a transformational crisis, it is an Agenda 2063 crisis. If we don't deal with it, our Agenda 2063 is really going to be threatened. And we do have opportunities to be able to achieve some of the aspirations there. The second one is to say that, there is a way to provide the cancellation, whether it is multilateral, bilateral, because this was done. It has been done. The African, multilateral banks are afraid of losing their AAA ratings. That's one of the reasons why they don't want to enter the current restructuring framework. But this thing is possible because they did do it 25 years ago. The African Development Bank did cancel a lot of debt for many African countries. So I think we need to find a way of making the political and economic argument more tighter for why a HIPC 2 can work and not affect credit rating agencies. The European Union did it during the bailout of the EU financial crisis. They bailed out banks. So the money we're talking about for Africa is pennies relative to what happened in the European financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And I think very lastly is there needs to be a credible argument politically from Africa that this is one of the options that needs to be on the table when we're dealing with the debt crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. I think I'll move us towards next steps in the interest of time. We have about 12 minutes left on the clock. So I'll go back to Professor Danny. How can reform of the IMF, the World Bank, and G20 processes become more inclusive if we are really to move things forward?
It's a tough question. There is a reform process, technically at least, of the multilateral development banks being undertaken. They are going through a reform to expand their lending capacity, motivated through a G20 process. There are a lot of issues that could have been in the agenda that are not, some of them dealing with governance. I think in that regard, one of the biggest issues that needs to be dealt with, and I think it's really unfortunate that it wasn't dealt with this year in the G20, is there needs to be a review of the IMF's operating procedures and governance arrangements. We've said that the IMF plays multiple conflicting roles in the debt process. That's one problem. The governance arrangements are a problem. There's very limited accountability to almost anybody in the process. So that's the second issue with the IMF. The third issue is that the IMF has acknowledged, even though it seems to be backtracking a little bit, that issues like climate, gender, inequality are macro critical, as they call this. They're relevant to the macro economies of countries, and that it therefore within their mandate. If they're taking on those issues, we need to understand better how they're doing that, make sure that they have appropriate operating principles and practices to do that in a way that's responsible and consistent with all international norms and standards and justice, and that they can be held accountable for doing that. And none of that has happened yet. So that's another thing. The third thing, area where the IMF, where there's a big question, because one of the big questions is, if we're talking about a different HIPC, we have to think about where's the money for that HIPC going to come from. And it's important to recognize the difference between HIPC in the prior HIPC and now is that the profile or the composition of the creditors is very different. In those days, the major creditors were official creditor agencies of the donor countries, and secondarily, the multilateral financial institutions. Today, the official creditors, including the new ones like China, are a relatively small part of the total picture. The private creditors and the multilateral financial institutions are the major creditors in Africa today. And so where's the money for that going to come from? Part of it, the private creditors, is obviously one issue. And there's a question of the responsibility of them that needs to be developed. But if the multilaterals are going to do it, where does the money come from? And that requires a discussion, in the case of the IMF, of the SDRs. And equally important is the fact that the IMF is a holder of a huge amount of gold that it values on its books at, I think, $45 an ounce, when we know the price of gold today is $4,000 an ounce. And is there an opportunity there to convert some of that money into a fund that can be used to deal more appropriately with debts in low-income countries in particular?
Thank you, Professor Danny. And over to you, Lucy, for your reflections on how we can move from global summits and rhetorics and publications to decisive action.
Yes, I think one of the things is also to look at the reality. I don't think we've discussed much of that right now, but Professor has mentioned it. The issue of climate change and the pandemic-related deaths, because we need money to address the impact of climate and all that. These are the things that we need to start reflecting. Another thing is, if we want reforms, we need to have all the creditors participating professionally and everybody on board discussing and seeing how we can make a change. Another thing is the system needs to be predictable in a way that if a country is in debt distress, and they are requesting for relief, or they are requesting for cancellation, or they are requesting for something, it needs to be fast. You will see the HIPC one, the process will take 5 to 7 years, and now we need to act with speed because of the challenges that countries are facing. And then another thing that I want to finalize and emphasize on is on sustainability. We need to stop looking at austerity and start looking at the social dimension, looking at the human dimension. And also we need to start reflecting on solutions that go beyond or temporarily reducing debt or suspending for some time, but looking at the sustainability of all these interventions. Because the truth is, people are lacking resources to access their basic needs. We need to free up these resources and ensure these situations are long-term. It goes beyond liquidity. We are looking at the solvency of it all. So in summary, the issue of climate change and the pandemic-related issues should be looked at. Creditor participation in all this dialogue and seeing how to change. Issues to do with the inordinate interest amounts that we pay because we are high risk. The issue of the system being predictable and STR, and also sustainability of all the solutions that we are proposing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And I think you've segued us into my final question for the panel, which I'll now channel to Professor Danny and Justin. So for you, what single action or principle should really guide the next phase of global debt justice, the global debt justice movement, as your parting reflections?
That's a question for me.
You first, and then just.
Okay. A nice simple question to end on. To be honest with you, I would say that the single most important change, not the most practical change, because I think it's a longer term issue, is to recognize that debt can't be treated as a technical, legal, and financial issue. It has to be treated holistically. That involves, so you look both at the legal issues, but you look also at the social, the environmental, the economic, the political, the cultural issues, so that we understand fully what the impacts are and do manage all of those in a coherent way that makes sense. That's a very difficult thing to do, but that's the change that we have to make. And if for no other reason, it's not just a debt issue. As Lucy said, it's also because of the climate crisis that we haven't discussed, but which is affecting the continent as profoundly as the debt crisis. So that we have to work out a way to integrate those, and that's the most important, I think.
Thank you, Professor. Justin, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, just building on what Professor Bradlow has said, I think moralizing the argument for the debt justice movement, like we did in 25 years ago under the Jubilee debt campaign, I think we need to make that moral argument a lot more stronger, because we've seen Kenya, Madagascar, Nigeria, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, young people are getting tired of having to carry the burden of corrupt leaders, inept leaders, leaders who don't have their interests at heart. Part of it is a tax issue, part of it is a debt issue, and governments are being toppled as a result of this. So I do think that we need to continue pushing a very strong moral argument, because essentially in Africa, what we're going to end up seeing is a complete collapse of the social fabric and social cohesion if we do not moralize this and use that to get the correct type of reforms and the correct type of outcomes that we need for our continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for closing out on that note. I think this has been a very insightful conversation, and there have been some really important points that have been raised. One of them being that we really must shift the narrative from debt being this abstract and technical issue to one that speaks to the justice related issues, to the moral arguments around it, in order for us to be able to advocate for the type of change that is required for developing countries to move away from the dependency and the perpetual cycle of indebtedness that has plagued developing countries over decades. There is a need for a focus on the shared responsibility around this issue. So the issue of debt transparency, whether it's in relation to the terms and conditions of the debt, the methodology of credit rating agencies, and the use of the resources that are being leveraged through the procurement of debt, and the implications for tax compliance and how it is felt at the very human level. So there's also a need to really balance the type of innovative instruments and solutions that we try to seek out. So if we are to impose limits and ceilings, what type of flexibility can we embed within these strategies to ensure that there is the right flexibility that countries can leverage to be able to respond to crises as they occur? So this has been a really useful conversation that undoubtedly would add to the ongoing discourse around what needs to be done to really pull developing countries out of this crisis. So I would, on this note, I really want to thank the panelists for the time you have taken to speak to us today and share insights, and for the passion that you have for the work that you do. So thank you, Professor Bradlow. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Lucy, for your insights and perspectives. We want to also thank for the partnership on this with the Conversation Africa on this webinar and on this very important issue. And lastly, we want to thank everyone that has joined us here today and taken time out of their busy schedules to join this very, very important discourse. Thank you for your time and goodbye.